the purpose of this brief presentation is to provide some practical help and tips as you read the Bock text for the Luke Acts class. And in particular, what I want to do is help you understand how to look at the literary references that he makes throughout the text. And so I want to move on here to, first of all, address the issue of how Bach uses Greek throughout his text. First of all, it's important to remember that Bach is a New Testament scholar. It's interesting to note that he actually references Hebrew words very rarely throughout his text, but he frequently uses Greek words. And he does usually transliterate those, and transliterate means that he'll put the word in Greek script, but then he will put it usually in italics in English script so that you can actually read the word. Um, but occasionally he has a tendency to include that transliterated word only in the first occurrence. So, for example, sometimes you'll see him addressing a topic such as Savior, and he'll use soteria, and then he will put that in the Greek script and then in the English script, and then as he goes through the rest of the text, he will just continue to use the Greek text again and again. So what you may need to do is develop some kind of strategy for reading his text. And I would recommend that you focus only on the key Greek terms in his text. For example, when he's addressing a topic such as the titles for Jesus, and he's going to use Savior or Lord, and then he's going to give you that Greek term at that point, you may want to just make sure you are able to identify that word and um, be able to follow the flow of the text to know what he's referencing at that point. Don't get bogged down in all of the phrases and trying to figure out all of the phrases and understanding them in English. You want to focus just on these key terms that relate to the key issue or the key topic that he's trying to address. And I think that will help you in approaching this book. So, first of all, he's mostly using Greek, and he occasionally has this tendency to keep using it without transliterating the words. The other thing that he does occasionally is reference Jewish literature and use abbreviations for that Jewish literature and not tell you what that means. And so you'll see throughout your text that he's going to use this abbreviation MT, and MT stands for the Masoretic text, which is the standard Hebrew and Aramaic text of the Old Testament. So if you take a Hebrew course at some point, you will actually purchase a Hebrew Bible, which is the Masoretic text. That is what the MT stands for. He also references the LXX throughout, and this stands for the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is a translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Common or Koine Greek around the 3rd century BCE. Now, he's interested in this because a lot of times when we read the New Testament writers are actually quoting the Greek Old Testament or that Greek translation of the Hebrew text. And so that's why he's going to reference that throughout. It's important for you to know MT is the Hebrew, LXX is the Greek version of the Old Testament or translation of the Old Testament. He also highlights a number of other texts throughout that emerge in the intertestamental or the Second Temple era. And so, first of all, what I wanted to do is remind you that the Second Temple context, we're talking about that period from the return of captivity back into the land until the time of Christ, and especially those few hundred years before Christ. There are a number of things that develop in Jewish history that are really significant. They're important as background information coming to the New Testament text and to the time of Jesus. And so if we look at that era, we see that there are these developing sects within Judaism. And so the Pharisees and the Essenes emerge. We see when we look at their literature that there's actually quite a bit of theological diversity among the different groups. We do see a kind of heightened messianic expectation during that time. And then during that time and in that literature, they start to quote Old Testament scriptures in unique ways and interpret them with the kind of messianic interpretation. And so when we look at that literature, we kind of understand what were they thinking about the Messiah, and that's what somewhat of what Bach is doing throughout his text. And then we see during that era, basically following the Babylonian exile, the synagogue system emerging. And this is where, they had small gatherings in their local communities. And of course, the temple was still important, but there was this local community center, basically, that really grows from the time of the return from Babylonian exile up until the time of Christ. Now, there are a few other types of literature that are important for you to know about, and these are the books that Bach references throughout. And you're not expected to know these or be able to identify all of these. I just want you to understand what he's referencing um, whenever he cites this material, and then again provide you some information as to why he's doing this. And the first is a set of 13 books, roughly 13 books, called the Old Testament Apocrypha. And they contain helpful historical, linguistic, and cultural information so that we understand what's going on in this Second Temple era or this intertestamental period. And examples of those books includes First and Second Esdras, Tobit, Judith, Baruch, Ecclesiasticus, First and Second Maccabees. You might find these actually if you open like a Catholic Bible, you'll find these intertestamental books. Or if you get um, um, further into your study, you may find yourself of the kind of Second Temple era being exposed to some of this literature. And it provides kind of interesting information about the history and culture and thought during this period. Some other texts that emerge are called the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. And whenever we say pseudepigrapha, that usually means like false writings. In other words, they're writings that are attributed to someone, but that person didn't really write them. And so we actually have New Testament pseudepigrapha as well, but this Old Testament pseudepigrapha is important for us to be aware of. Again, they provide important information, historical, linguistic, cultural information about um, that era, that Second Temple era. And then they often tend to include Old Testament references. They help us try to understand, or they can teach us how Old Testament texts were being interpreted or understood during that time. And we should note those are not like authoritative interpretations, but they are interpretations we can be aware of. Some of those texts are among those that were found with the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries. And those texts include Jubilees, First Enoch, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. And I've included in the course a number of small articles, dictionary type articles that you may want to read. Actually, the Anchor Bible Dictionary article provides a list of these texts if you want to be able to access that or learn more about that in the future. And then I wanted to just note that there is this kind of growth of rabbinic literature throughout this era. And so, you may have heard of these before, like the Midrash is the collection of Jewish commentaries on the Old Testament. The Targums are collections of paraphrases and commentaries on the Old Testament text, actually in Aramaic. So remember, as we move into the time of Jesus, that um, most of the Jews living in Palestine at his time actually spoke Aramaic. And so there was this need to kind of explain the scriptures in the common language of the Jews in that era. Um, just like the Old Testament had to be translated into Koine Greek because Jews were moving all over the Mediterranean area and sometimes lived in areas where they spoke Greek. So Aramaic was a language that the text needed to be available in and understood in. So that's what that was all about. You've also probably heard of the Mishnah, which is a catalog of oral laws uh, for understanding how to live out the Jewish law. And so they were kind of extrapolations. And you probably heard about this, especially with the Pharisees during the time of Jesus. And then there's the Talmud, which is a set of commentaries on the Mishnah. And so Again, all of this literature, this Jewish literature and that Second Temple era literature, uh, sets a background for the discussion of the New Testament and New Testament literature. So scholars will often then look to the Second Temple Jewish literature to understand if or how the New Testament writers may be using certain phrases or certain quotations or even certain biblical references during that era. And so some questions emerge or scholars may want to pose as they approach a text. Do the New Testament writers use Septuagint language? And we see that Luke does that. And if he uses the Septuagint language, the Greek translation language, when maybe Matthew doesn't, why does he do that? Is he doing that for a specific purpose? And scholars will want to dig into that. Secondly, do they cite Old Testament texts similarly? Um, to the writers in that Second Temple literature? And if they do, then why are they doing that? Are they trying to make a bridge to a thought that was kind of contemporary at that time? And then do they address issues raised in the literature? So perhaps that Second Temple Jewish literature raises an issue. And we know, for example, there's more thinking about the Messiah during that time, references to the Psalms and Isaiah regarding the messianic expectation and hope of what he'll be, that he would be coming soon. And so, um, there may be times when New Testament writers are trying to address those issues in that literature. And so that's what scholars want to do. They just want to try to dig in there and see if that might be what's going on. And that is what you sometimes see Bock doing in his texts. So while these texts, those Second Temple Jewish literature type of texts, are not authoritative, right? They're not inspired. They don't have any authority to teach us what's true and not true about the Messiah. Um, they can be instructive and they can help us understand the culture and language and thinking of that era. And that is what Bach is trying to help us understand at different points when he references these texts or these different kinds of literature throughout his text. Thank you so much.